Hi, I'm Lisa Walkish, the National Managing Principal of Industry at Grant Thornton. Today, Diane Swamp, our Chief Economist, and Bob Hirsch, our National Managing Principal of Industry, will discuss the impact that COVID has had on the manufacturing sector. They'll talk about the wage gaps, the skills gaps, and the impact COVID has had on supply chains. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and Diane.
Thanks, Lisa. The overall economy, the outlook has improved quite significantly with the passage of the new aid bill. Not only do we have $900 billion that was passed in December, much of it slated to expire in March. Now that $1.9 trillion in aid that's coming down the pike. Not all of that will be spent this year, but they're providing much needed support where the last bill left off, particularly for those low wage workers that were hit hardest. We're now looking at growth in the United States of excess of 6%, 6.5% to 7% in 2021. That would be the strongest year since 1984, after the worst year since 1946, when millions of soldiers returned home from World War II. The recovery that we see, much of it will be over the spring and summer. That's where the strongest gains are expected to come. We have a long way to go, so we're getting a nice bounce, but we're more than a year into it. And I think what's important to remember is this is no longer about just eradicating the virus, which was once hope, where we just flip on a switch and the world will return to normal. We're now looking at managing the virus. So that rosy scenario is very contingent on the fact that the virus doesn't flare again with the mutations we're seeing, and that we get enough people vaccinated so we get to some form of herd immunity to reduce contagion quite dramatically. The aid bill also had $45 billion in it for vaccinations, testing, and tracing. Those will all help us to manage this virus as we go forward. Like I said, the biggest concern is that not only we reopen and see restrictions lifted, but we also have to stay open and gain momentum over the course of the year. If we were to stay at the job gains that we saw in the month of February, it would still take us 25 months to recoup the losses that we endured just during the recession, and that's not including what would have been the over 2 million jobs we've lost since then as well, that we haven't generated because the economy was not growing. So the idea is that this will get us back on a higher trajectory of growth if we don't get another setback. It also hedges us against what has become a reality, is we often lose momentum as cases surge again, and we're dealing with something viruses do. They mutate, and we can't always contain the contagion of the virus as much as we'd like. Of those 9.5 million jobs that are still in the hole, over 3/4 of them are in the service sector. Another good chunk is in the public sector, where we've lost a lot of jobs in education, 1.3 million jobs at the state and local level, almost all of them in education, which we not only need those back, we need those and then some to catch up on the education loss to the Great Recession. The other last point that's important to make about the recovery in 2021, although we will, I think, hit the previous peak in economic activity, not in jobs, in the second quarter of 2021, as we get into 2021 and 2022, we're talking about shifting from an economy that bought a lot of goods, people who were working from home, that hybrid of working from home. We were willing to invest in everything from nicer vehicles, boats, RVs, and everything to fill our homes, furniture, remodeling, appliances. All of that helped to lift the manufacturing sector. We're going to shift more into discretionary spending, but of course the pent-up demand associated with services is different than the pent-up demand with goods. You have to replace a car that has been deteriorating during a recession, where in the case of the service sector, you can't replace haircuts lost to lockdowns. You can't replace all of the meals that you didn't go out in restaurants. You will see some pent-up demand in domestic travel. Business travel will come back slower than leisure travel, and there will ultimately be some flares in inflation tied to that. But I think it's important to understand that it's not the same kind. It's another unique aspect of how the recovery, the rebound in economic activity, layering discretionary services on top of that goods recovery we've seen already really take root in the U.S.
So Diane, this is all really interesting, and what stands out to me with all of the labor statistics you just went through is there's a dichotomy in manufacturing. That there is this pent-up demand. The manufacturing sector in general is doing very well, but there are a huge amount of jobs that are unfilled in the manufacturing sector, right? So if we could kind of cover that gap, we could make a good dent in those, in the job deficits that you just highlighted. But there's a dichotomy here, right? There are a lot of jobs out there, but there aren't people to fill it. And it comes down to there's a skills gap, right? And it's not just shop floor factory workers, it's up and down the food chain, it's up and down the career path, the education level. It goes from the shop floor all the way up to the C-suite. And what we're seeing right now is, in manufacturing, since those people aren't there, the industry is trying to bridge that gap on its own, right? So it's not just a matter of finding the people, it's a matter of getting them those skills that they need to perform in a manufacturing environment, and then showing them a career path or a path to where they can continually add on to those skills to make them more viable, more employable in the overall economy. So it's really not the old days of I need a unskilled worker on the shop floor. It's more of I need people that understand not only a complex manufacturing process, but how do I control that process? Do I understand the statistics around controlling a process? Can I interact with high-tech means of manufacture, such as artificial intelligence, even machine learning, and knowing how to program a CNC machine. All of those knowledge workers are where the gap is, and we need to make a concerted effort on filling that gap. Now, what I see with my clients right now is they're trying to fill that gap on their own. So they're trying to get creative on in-house training or in-house career coaching and career development. And we're making strides, but nowhere near where we're going to need as the economy comes out of the recession and that pent-up demand starts hitting manufacturing even harder than it has. I think we're going to see sort of an acute need for those skills, and we're going to have to figure out how to fill that either through automation or skills development in our people. So Diane, to me, that also starts another conversation around the wage gap and what's out there in the market. So I'd like to hear what you have to say or what your opinion is on the wage gap issue.
So what we're seeing is high wage workers actually not only have they regained the jobs that were lost to the recession, but are now starting to exceed those numbers, while the unemployment rate for the bottom quartile of wage earners out there is still in excess of 20%, according to the Federal Reserve. It's important that the overall unemployment rates don't include all those people who have dropped out of the labor force. And what's been so unique about this recession was it not hitting the manufacturing sector as pervasively as it hit the service sector. And so it hit women, particularly Black and Hispanic women, much harder than it hit men. This is one of the reasons people have called it a she-cession. We've seen some of that come back, but it still is a long way to go. But again, you see those really big differences between the low-wage workers, their unemployment rate very, very high and elevated, and the higher skilled and higher wage workers seeing pockets of actual tightness where some wages are being bid up.
Yep, and I see that again in my clients, because what happens is our clients or just in the industry in general will train individuals in those knowledge workers that you just described, Diane, and they become more employable. So the mobility is there to jump from job to job. And so there's also an aspect of this. It's the training, it's the career path, but there's this aspect of retention that also needs to be addressed in the market, in the industry. So it's all kind of related. It's all it's all interdependent. But what we're seeing and what I would like to see is more focus on education, both in the public sector, in our public schools, and in our formal education, so that our clients don't sort of have to go it alone all the time. Now, there's always going to be very specific or very purposeful, training on a given technology in a particular manufacturing environment. That's never going to go away. But I think we could make a lot of strides, with the overall educational environment, if we could get that base that base education shored up so that we can focus on expanding the more knowledge-based skills that we're going to need to compete going forward. And so I know, Diane, you talk a lot about how we've not really invested in education, something like the last 40 years, right? And
Exactly.
we really need to start figuring out how we help our manufacturing industry bridge that gap, and that's just just one of many ways we need to do it.
The shortfall, just to add on, dovetail into what you're saying, that shortfall in education, of course, got exacerbated by COVID. And we not only lost over a year of education to some of our lowest wage households, basic education, the hardest hit scores across income strata over the last year due to COVID was in math scores, and that's some of the basic skills that manufacturers need most on a shop floor, and that's where we've seen the hardest hit.
Like, these are the challenges, and I think we are poised, especially in the manufacturing industry, to overcome those things. But there are certain challenges that that really need to be addressed head on, and I see that happening. I'm starting to see that momentum build, but I would like to see more of it, because there's a huge opportunity there, both for individual companies and the economy as a whole. So, hey, Diane, let me change the topic just a little bit on supply chain, right? Because what we're seeing with the pandemic, and as we come out of the pandemic, and what's been really brought to the forefront here is the security around supply chain. Specifically, just a few examples in the recent press around semiconductor availability, around aluminum and steel availability and prices in the market. The integrated supply chains in the economy, it's not so simple to say we're going to reshore those things or re-optimize those, because there are a lot of dependencies. I'd like to get your take from a macroeconomic viewpoint of what does that mean, and how do we deal with that, and what are you seeing in the research that you're doing?
Well, it's really interesting is, one of the largest, I've been on the line with a lot of and off the record meetings with economists from every major industry in the United States and 25 countries around the world, as well as policymakers in the last couple of weeks. The number one concern across the board was the relationship between Taiwan and China, because Taiwan produces about 90% of those chips that go into manufacturing that have already disrupted production, most notably in the vehicle industry. And so whatever goes on between China and Taiwan, the real fear of them doing to Hong Kong what they did and doing that to Taiwan is the real concern out there, a geopolitical risk. And we've already seen tensions rise in the South China Sea. We've also seen a real shortage of container shortages coming out of China. They're the major producer of containers. The large containers, many of them are empty. They're not being filled. There's a real backlog in the LA ports, which is adding to all of these supply chain issues. And you're starting to hear, manufacturers talk about just-in-case inventories instead of just-in-time inventories. And when you do that, of course, that's costly, because they're trying to hedge their bets, either build up inventories or find multiple suppliers around the world, so that if something happens in one part of the world, of course, they can then pick it up somewhere else. That said, pandemics are global in scope, and so the fact that we are so intricately laced within the supply chain makes it very difficult even to hedge, because there's so many pivot points and pressure points along that supply chain that you have to intervene and hedge to make sure you're getting all the parts you need to put together even one vehicle.
Yeah, and think about it, Diane. It's like what I see, because I talk a lot to our colleagues in Europe, and the level of openness, or the level of reopening economy varies from country to country, which also compromises or compounds the issues that we have with the supply chain that you've just kind of outlined. So a lot of challenges,
Exactly.
but a lot of opportunity, and it's actually an exciting time to be part of the manufacturing industry, because there's just so much momentum building, and I think we're at a point where, almost at an inflection point, where you're going to start seeing a lot of advanced technology being applied to these problems, and we need to be out in front of that, both as a country, as a firm, and to help our clients. So again, thank you for your comments, Diane, and thank you everyone for listening.